A little while ago, I brought up Shining Force Gaiden and Sword of Haja, which were two Game Gear Shining Force games that were meant to fill in the time between the mainline entries. Between Shining Force 2 and Shining Force 3, not only did Sega fans get to see the release of one last Gaiden game for the Game Gear, this last campaign would tie together all of the Shining games that came before it. This game would come to be known as Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict. Similar to Gaiden 1, Final Conflict never saw an official release outside of Japan. Although I played both Gaiden 1 and 2 in Japanese, I could not justify doing the same for Final Conflict. For one, a translation patch courtesy of Shining Force Central actually exists, and I knew of it before playing the game for myself. But the appeal of Final Conflict is to partake in the narrative journey. While Shining Force 1 and 2 take place in the same world, they could both be treated as independent works. The only direct connection the two games have is through passing references that you have to know are actually a callback to the first Shining Force. The goal of Final Conflict was to provide that context. In fact, a townsperson living in Hassan during Shining Force 2 actually foreshadows what the story for this prequel would end up being about. In the opening demo, we see Max and Adam leading a new Shining Force at the Desert Shrine, in a gambit to stop Michaela. However, Adam gets nearly destroyed, the rest of the group is disorganized, and Max decides to pursue Michaela on his own. Such is the story hook of the game going forward. The hero from the very first Shining Force game has gone missing, with no one completely sure if he's been captured or not. So it is up to a young man by the name of Ian to accompany Adam in locating Max. It's never outright stated, but it is heavily implied that Ian is also the direct ancestor to Bowie, Shining Force 2's protagonist. There's not much to comment on with the story, despite that being the game's core appeal. It has some decent characters that will join the Shining Force. For a Game Gear game, they're surprisingly fleshed out. Even the villains get an appreciated amount of nuance, with Lynx in particular probably being my favorite Shining Force antagonist. But I will say that Ian's true identity comes off as too much of a contrived retcon for the sake of fanservice, which was not the first nor last time I felt that way regarding this game's story. Did you like Shining Force 2? Because this game feels like a huge mix of Shining Force 2's basic plot points reordered and abridged. The overall context is different, but the journey feels all too familiar. You start by going to the Desert Shrine, making your way to Bedeau, finding the Nazca ship and flying it to Grand's Island as you fight your way to Ground Seal Tower. They really didn't try to disguise it. And I hope that you're interested in that story because the gameplay is completely unremarkable. This game plays exactly like Shining Force Gaiden and features no standout mechanics that set it apart from the previous games. In fact, there was only one improvement that I noticed. Final Conflict appears to be the first game in the series that gets rid of the randomized turn order. Now every character is organized into a static list based on their agility stats. This is not something I was able to absolutely verify, but I certainly noticed it when enemies got 2 turns before some of my other units in Shining Force 2, whereas I didn't notice that occurring in this game and the upcoming Shining Force 3. While I'm still not a huge fan of the dynamic phase selection, the increased consistency of Final Conflict makes such a system tolerable, as I can more easily predict when every character is going to move. If there's a certain character I want to put focus into leveling up, I have a better idea of which enemies I can leave behind for their attacks. It's without question I make the claim that Final Conflict is the most challenging game of the Game Gear titles. While not an intensely difficult game, it does have some fairly decent challenge level in terms of enemy strength. The EXP curve seems to have been adjusted so that characters don't gain quite as much experience. They'll probably still snowball with a bit of effort, but even still the map design is going to try to put you back into place. If a map does have a gimmick associated with it, they usually don't appear until about halfway through. So they're difficult to plan for, but not unfairly so. Not that the map design is always excellent, I found the later chapters to be fiercely annoying. It's not really in the actual layouts where they trip you up, but in terms of enemy placement and composition. Good luck with all the long-range magic users and bow centaurs. I swear, this game has a fetish for enemy types that have the range advantage over your army. It really didn't take that long for me to get worn down by this game. I didn't have a super strong desire to continually play it. It's certainly not a bad game and is well made with everything being considered, but it really didn't stand out to me at all. On one hand, the overall difficulty for this game is much more in line for where I wanted the other Game Gear games to be. It plays the best of the 3 handheld Shining Force games, even if only marginally. On the other hand, because this game relies so much on fan service for the 2 mainline games, It is a prerequisite to know the stories for both Shining Force 1 and 2. Furthermore, it reuses so many of the same locations, story beats, and music that it makes Final Conflict come off as lacking an identity of its own. I feel like I might have jumped the gun when I so hastily proclaimed that Gaiden 2 was my least favorite Shining Force, because now I say that it actually goes to Final Conflict instead. At least for Gaiden 2, I loved most of the game and it did use original map designs and characters. Final Conflict, on the other hand, just comes off as feeling like a recycled Shining Force 2 that tries too hard to shove in as much Shining Force 1 fan service as possible. It's kind of a shame I feel that way. If you're only going to play one of the Game Gear games, you might as well play Final Conflict. After all, it's more relevant to the Shining Force canon than the previous 2 Gaiden games, and since it does tie together the most iconic games in the series, it has appeal the other games don't. This story does bridge the gap not only between Shining Force 1 and 2, but even Shining in the Darkness as well. It's kind of fitting that this is the case, because the very next Shining game that Camelot would develop was Shining the Holy Ark, which established an entirely new world and canon along with Shining Force 3. This isn't a game I would recommend unless you're a die-hard Shining Force fan. Unlike with Gaiden 1 and 2, Final Conflict has no remade version to help make the game more palatable, so you're stuck with the Game Gear version. Because of that, it still suffers from the same issues the other Game Gear games have had as well. Those being the small screen size, slow processing speed, and lack of explorable towns to help break up the pacing. I honestly think reading a wiki to get a summary of the plot is a preferable experience to actually playing Final Conflict, which I think is the sign that maybe your time is better spent elsewhere. Like, for example, the best Shining Force game. Stay tuned, folks.